The rise of Amaris. When introduced to Richard Cameron in August 2753, he knew just how to attract the bored boy's attention and curiosity. From beneath his cloak, Stefan Amaris produced an ornate book of stories about chivalry and knighthood. When activated, a small holographic scene in wondrous colour and detail appeared on one page, depicting a scene from the text on the facing page. Richard was entranced by both book and this mustachioed leader from a far distant realm. The friendship blossomed, and soon Amaris was accompanying the lonely boy through his daily routine of studies and endless audiences with a long stream of officials. Considering Richard's extreme isolation, his immediate fondness for Amaris isn't surprising. Here was a man who understood his favourite stories, who claimed to share Richard's beliefs, and who seemed to listen. No one in Unity City cared enough for Richard Cameron to recognise that he was still a boy with a child's needs. The only person he found to comfort him would turn that trust to his own secret ends. Under Amaris's influence, Richard Cameron began to change. He grew ever more petulant, demanding and outraged when denied anything for any reason. He cried, he yelled, and he sneered, alienating the few people who did care for him. Amaris approved and even encouraged the future First Lord's expectations by saying that in the Rimworld's Republic, Richard would be treated like a god. Under Amaris's influence, Richard came to believe that everyone should bow to his will simply because he was a Cameron. Anyone who didn't was an imbecile or a traitor, and the young First Lord took careful note of those who didn't yield to him. He remembered every insult, every slight, however small, and waited for his 18th birthday when he would have his revenge on everyone who didn't show him the respect he was due. To restrain his anger for a decade required remarkable control, a sign of how vindictive Richard Cameron had become. The Lords of the High Council, busy with their own unscrupulous plans, were pleased that someone was keeping the young First Lord occupied and not intruding on their work. Others of the court thought the two were just good friends. Yet some didn't trust the overly polite Amaris, whose whispering into the First Lord's ear sent shivers down their spines. These nobles made several attempts to reduce his influence, but the First Lord believed he had finally found someone he could trust. As for General Kerensky, though Richard's regent, he was so pressed by his duties as commander of the military that he had few chances to see the boy, let alone form an opinion about the friendship he'd formed with Stefan Amaris. When Amaris received a pile of extravagant gifts from the boy during the holidays of 2754, he realised how total was his influence over the boy. Knowing his position was secure, Amaris began to poison the lad's thoughts so that Richard began to see everything as a threat. If, for example, one of his teachers tried to discipline him, he would assume it was an act intended to shame the First Lord. Amaris must have gloated privately at how easy it was to sway the child. Vultures gather. When the Council Lords passed their laws imposing heavy taxes on the periphery in 2752, they unleashed the fury of many underground periphery movements bent on overthrowing the Star League. This unfair tax burden outweighed any previous political and ideological differences among these organisations and gave them a common rallying point. Many periphery worlds suddenly became battlegrounds after well-organised and well-equipped terrorists staged attacks. Taken by surprise, the SLDF forces in the periphery suffered heavy casualties. The bombing of troop ships or the poisoning of a military base's water supply would become commonplace. The SLDF in the periphery was ill-equipped to respond. Mechs were useless against lone saboteurs, and even the best-trained soldier had no defence against assassins supported by the local populace. Even worse, for the Star League, some SLDF troops were beginning to become sympathetic to the periphery's cause. General Kerensky had few choices. He couldn't keep his troops inside their bases like besieged knights in castles because it was their duty to collect taxes from the hostile people. Nor could he expect his troops to walk through the gates into one ambush after another. Hoping that the sight of more soldiers would discourage the guerrilla violence, Kerensky reluctantly ordered in more troops. The Special Armed Services was the regular army's elite anti-terrorist combat organisation. Recruited solely from members of the hegemony armed forces, the SAS quickly established itself as the Star League's premier institution for covert operations and anti-terrorist missions. The few who knew of the existence of the SAS called its members the Black Hearts, because they traditionally left their calling cards on the bodies of their victims. The cynical motto, which meant, by this sign you will conquer. In 2753, the SLDF had about 100 battalion-sized SAS squads. General Kerensky sent all but a few into the periphery. He assigned them the monumental task of finding and rooting out the groups responsible for the terrorist activities, saying, without resorting to equally violent action. Outnumbered and facing a public as determined as the underground groups, the SAS began to resort to tactics as brutal as those of their opponents. On the other side, the periphery governments began to take a more active role in the growing revolt, secretly funding the underground organisations and providing them with support and alibis. The governments also began to hamper the efforts of the SLDF forces to track down the suspects. Only the Rimworld's Republic appeared to remain staunchly loyal to the Star League. Terrorism was not nearly as rampant there as there were in the other three realms. Indeed, the Amaris government made a big show of how ruthlessly they hunted down suspects accused of terrorism and handing them over to the Star League for trial. In retrospect, it's easy to say that General Kerensky and the rest of the Star League should have been suspicious of the way the Rimworld's Republic had reacted to the revolt. At the time, however, they welcomed any help from any quarter as it tried to contain what threatened to become a catastrophe. Birthday Proclamation. As unrest increased in the periphery, the Star League began to suffer from the lack of Cameron control. Despite the new tax money flowing from the periphery into the inner sphere, the massive build-up of the House armies still trained the economies of the five realms. The healthy economic signs of just a few years before, near full employment, high wages and major work benefits, began to deteriorate. Unemployment climbed into double digits in 3 member states. The 5 council lords ignored these economic problems, so preoccupied were they with outfitting and training their new regiments. They even lost interest in running the League. Without a First Lord, the council lords were supposed to be in charge. When only 2 or 3 attended meetings of the High Council, effective government became impossible. The Bureau of Star League Affairs tried to handle some of the responsibilities without overstepping its legal bounds, but its efforts lacked the force of law. Many career diplomats and bureaucrats whose loyalty and dedication had been the core of the government began to resign in disgust. Morale plummeted throughout the League government. Stefan Amaris was pleased. The growing government discord, the shaking of the realm's economies, and the continuing urban wars in the periphery all fit into his plans. His friendship with the now adolescent Richard Cameron was firm. Richard saw Amaris as his closest confidant and as a substitute father, and Amaris did everything to encourage this. Richard's trust was the foundation for all of Amaris's coming plans. Until 2755, Amaris had resisted the urge to manipulate the young leader. He wanted to be certain that Richard grew up trusting only him, but he also needed to soothe the fears of the few nobles suspicious of his intentions. After 4 years, and with the young teenage ruler eager to show his authority, Amaris began to exert more control. Richard Cameron, though still too young to assume complete control, was allowed to sit in and comment on all High Council meetings. Until Amaris suggested it, Richard didn't go to the meetings, which suited the purposes of the Council Lords just fine. The appearance of the First Lord at the 2755 winter meeting was definitely a shock. The sight of the slim youth sitting in the ornate chair of the First Lord was disconcerting. Even more surprising was his announcement that, to honour his friend's birthday, he was making Stefan Amaris a Knight of the Star League. He added that, as a further sign of the Star League's gratitude to the leader from the Rimworld's Republic, SLDF units would be withdrawn from his realm. The Council Lords were too stunned to react. The First Lord received the necessary certifications from each one to make the proclamations legal before any had the wit to question them. The Lords later wrote that each had been so perplexed by Richard Cameron's request that they thought to object only after the birthday proclamations had become law. The knighthood created considerable public controversy. Many were outraged that a man of such unscrupulous nature and backwoods origin would be given a knighthood. To them, the Star League list of knights was tainted by inclusion of a man of no worth or integrity. The public was unaware of the struggle the second birthday proclamation created between Richard Cameron and General Kerensky. To abandon the Rimworlds with only Stefan Amaris to combat anti-League forces was bad enough, but Richard Cameron specifically ordered Kerensky to turn over all Star League bases and fortresses to the military of Stefan Amaris. General Kerensky would not allow this. In a series of sharply worded messages from the periphery, the general said that he would never submit to an order that would hand over Star League technology to a periphery realm. Richard Cameron, at the urging of Stefan Amaris, demanded that the general carry out this order. Though the Council Lords must have had their own misgivings, they sided with the First Lord. The High Council considered General Kerensky, with the might of the SLDF and charisma on his side, to be the more formidable adversary. Even if it meant siding with Amaris, the Lords were willing to do anything to drive a wedge between General Kerensky and the First Lord. With the First Lord and the High Council united against him, Kerensky had no choice but to accept the order. The regular army began to evacuate installations in the Rimworld's Republic, but not before Kerensky had stripped everything from all bases, forts, and fortresses. He wanted nothing handed over to the Republic that might benefit it or give it insight into their operation. Unfortunately, he failed. At Fort McHenry, a typical Star League fortress, stripping was so inept that more than 50% of the facility was in working order, while at Hevrol Aerobase, computer memories were improperly wiped, leaving behind many files of sensitive SLDF documents. Stefan Amaris was overjoyed at obtaining access to the secrets of General Kerensky's military. These were the gifts he'd wanted, and he immediately began to scheme on how best to use them to his advantage. Setting the trap. The need for fresh SLDF troops to relieve divisions that had been mauled in the periphery required that more troops be called up from the hegemony. By July 2765, more than 60% of the fighting units normally stationed near Terra had been called into the war, leaving behind increasingly fearful hegemony citizens. At the urging of Stefan Amaris, First Lord Richard asked the Council Lords to use the House militaries to help put down the periphery war. Because he hadn't held a High Council session in 2 years, and because the First Lord's taxation edict had been largely responsible for this rebellion, the Council Lords had no intention of using their militaries. At the request of General Kerensky, however, most of the realms provided transportation and other units and services for the SLDF. With the Terran hegemony underdefended, rumours began to fly of suspicious troop movements in the Draconis Combine. It was at the height of these rumours that First Lord Richard Cameron revealed the treaty that he'd signed with Stefan Amaris, allowing for units from the Rimworld's Republic to defend the Terran hegemony. Even Richard didn't know that Amaris had planted the rumours and had targeted them against the Combine to destroy the credibility of Takiro Kirita, a long-time critic of Amaris. Initial reaction to the treaty was negative. Many in the hegemony couldn't accept the presence of the foreign troops, much less entrust them with the defence of the cradle of humanity. Those who disagreed with the plan became even more vocal when they learned that General Kerensky opposed it, and when the general had heard of the treaty, he immediately sent the First Lord an alternative plan. Kerensky said the First Lord could easily hire regiments from the more trustworthy member states, such as the Lyran Commonwealth, and the Federated Sons to assume some of the defensive burden. The Amaris coup. As he travelled toward Terra, Stefan Amaris listened closely to the news coming from the hegemony and the periphery. From the hegemony, he heard very little to alarm him. Resistance to his Republican troops was growing, but still too small to have any effect. From the periphery came reports of continued heavy fighting, demanding General Kerensky's undivided attention. Pleased, Amaris sent streams of coded messages to his officers and agents in the hegemony. By the time he arrived at Unity City on the snowy night of December 26, 2766, all of his key personnel were ready to act. The next day dawned, cold but beautiful. After the snowstorm of the night prior, the storm had left behind clear skies and a layer of fresh snow, through which Stefan Amaris and his guards trudged across the open courtyard leading to the First Lord's private chambers. Amaris had a 9 o'clock audience with Richard Cameron, and he didn't want to be late. The Amaris group went unchallenged past the guards at the door, who had standing orders to admit Amaris and anyone with him. Carrying a large box tied with satin ribbons, Stefan Amaris continued with his bodyguards down the ornate corridors with their white marble pillars, past the sentries in their cloaks hiding ablative flak suits and weapons, and past the elaborate security strongpoints hidden among the decorative ornate carvings and sculptures. When Amaris and his guards entered the private audience chamber of the First Lord, they found Richard Cameron eagerly waiting. Amaris and Richard exchanged greetings, with Amaris complimenting the First Lord on his decisive and capable administration since their last meeting. Then, with a flourish and a smile, Amaris handed the First Lord the present, saying it was a gift from one friend to another. Richard tore through the wrapper and opened the box, only to discover another, identically wrapped package inside. Laughing, he repeated the procedure, and after working through box after box, he finally discovered a large laser pistol, set with ornate jewels, and with the Amaris crest carved into the grip. Amaris reached out and took the pistol from the First Lord, saying that it was a very special weapon, made to his exact specifications. He held the gun up to the light, letting the jewels catch and reflect it. Amaris then slowly lowered the pistol until its barrel was pointed at the First Lord's forehead. From outside came the sounds of distant explosions. "It has begun," Amaris said as he pulled the trigger. As the body of Richard Cameron slumped to the floor, Stefan Amaris sat down in a plush chair and calmly watched his guards leap into action. They pushed aside a large painting on a wall, revealing a hidden panel that controlled the security systems for the First Lord's private quarters. On instructions from Amaris, to whom Richard had proudly shown the panel's workings years before, the guards quickly took manual control of the many automated sentry systems in that wing of the palace. Amaris interrupted the guards only once, motioning to the body of Richard Cameron and the growing pool of blood. He asked one of them to clean up the unsightly mess. Conquest of the hegemony. Before 2765, there were 25 divisions in the Terran hegemony. These included fleets, supplies, and planetary militia units. By December 2766, all but 8 divisions, only 2 of them battlement divisions, had been sent to the periphery. Reinforcing these divisions were only a handful of independent SLDF regiments and planetary garrisons made up of aging veterans with reserve status and young men and women hoping to get into a military academy. Arrayed against the regular army and the hegemony were Republican regiments and brigades, with a total strength of 16 divisions. Even on Terra, Republican troops outnumbered the SLDF. Even as Stefan Amaris was murdering Richard Cameron, his regiments were pouncing on regular army units throughout the hegemony. Republican troops used surprise to devastating advantage, with tactics like destroying regular army barracks filled with sleeping soldiers and flooding troop ships with poison gas. Regular army forces stationed further from Republican forces fared little better. Amaris had made a point of having adequate air support for his strike, and among the weapons used by the Republican aerospace fighters were nuclear bombs, which they used enthusiastically on SLDF units untouched by the opening moves of the coup. Other prime targets were the hegemony communication centres, for Amaris wanted to prevent any call for help. Squads of Amaris commandos had little trouble seizing these lightly defended sites and shutting them down. Though HBG operators in the surrounding member states noticed the sudden cessation of messages from the hegemony, it took days for their concern to work its way up through channels, and by then it was too late. Surprise and ruthlessness were the keys to Amaris' grand plan, and it succeeded on almost every hegemony world. The Throne Room Massacre. Amaris would broadcast an ultimatum over all channels that called for SLDF soldiers to lay down their weapons and surrender, or he would kill the First Lord. The ruse largely succeeded. Many units, badly mauled or outnumbered by Rimworld's troops, did lay down their weapons. Those who surrendered were forced to dig their own graves before they were shot. Those who didn't surrender were chased away from the major cities and hunted down. Many lancers of the 191st Royal Battlement Division, of which the Black Watch regiment had been part, survived the initial slaughter and escaped. They continued to fight for 2 years, with some surviving to see the liberation of Terra. Reasonably secure on Terra, Amaris listened with pleasure to reports from the other hegemony worlds. His plan was almost a total success. Of the 103 worlds, 95 had fallen under his control in the first day. Though a few units had held out and others resorted to raiding, Amaris' forces controlled all the worlds by the end of the year. Many of the castles, Brian, and the space defense systems were captured intact and now belonged to Republican soldiers. In a gruesome ceremony, Amaris forced the surviving soldiers of the Palace Guard to remove the Star League standard from the flagpoles and run up the Amaris family crest. Then he ordered the prisoners shot, and their bloody bodies buried at the foot of the flagpoles with the Star League flag as their burial shroud. Amaris next turned his attention to the Cameron family. Richard's wife, Elise, and 2-year-old daughter Amanda were in custody. Consulting computer records, he traced the names and locations of everyone who might have even a trace of Cameron blood. He brought these people to the court of the Star League, treating them with kindness and courtesy until the whole group had finally arrived. Amaris assembled 79 men, women and children of the Cameron family in the throne room. Sitting on the Star League throne and protected by many guards, he gave the distant relatives of the Camerons an ultimatum: swear allegiance or die. He had them brought before him, one by one, to answer. Not one of the first 20 yielded to Amaris, who accepted their answer and asked them to rejoin the rest. The 21st relative of the Camerons, Jason Cameron Bashina, agreed to bow to Amaris. With a cruel grin, he shot Jason Bashina with the same laser pistol that killed Richard. With no chance to live, the rest of the Camerons rushed the throne, only to be cut down by the surrounding guards. After the smoke from the charred bodies had cleared, Stefan Amaris left the throne room and ordered it sealed. Elsewhere on Terra, similar atrocities occurred. The Greenhaven Gestapo, a notorious mercenary band, took control of Rome and tortured the people of that city for a decade. In 2770, the mercenaries, after an attempt to extort money and riches from the already stripped Roman Vatican City, killed Pope Clement XXVII and many cardinals and bishops of the Roman Catholic Church. Across Terror and the hegemony, Stefan Amaris destroyed everything that had to do with the Star League or the Camerons. Amaris wanted the memory of the Star League expunged from the face of every planet, to be replaced by his family crest, the symbol of the cruel Amaris Empire. Warriors without a home. In January 2767, General Kerensky had led the attack to retake New Vandenberg. For a year he'd been at the head of an offensive to regain the Turian Concordat. Though he faced stiff resistance from the periphery, he finally gained the upper hand. With the seizure of New Vandenberg complete, and the submission of the Concordat likely to follow soon, the general hoped to pressure the neighbouring realms to submit with a minimum of bloodshed. Yet, certain things worried him. The large enemy battlement divisions, once so eager to engage in combat, began to avoid big battles. It seemed to General Kerensky that they were waiting for something. His message to Terror, telling the First Lord of his victory on Vandenberg, went unanswered. Then General Kerensky heard Stefan Amaris proclaim himself the First Lord, and an unbelieving Kerensky immediately asked for a status report from commanders in the hegemony. The few still alive told the general that there was no hope for the SLDF units that were still fighting. On May 19th, the general received a message whose full implication had filled him with horror. From Stefan Ukras Amaris, Emperor of the Amaris Empire, to General Alexander S. Kerensky, Commander of the late Star League Defense Forces. General, I, with my infinite skills and aided by my loyal subjects, have struck, with a swiftness given only to the righteous, a blow that has corrected decades of injuries and slights to my family. I rule where the Camerons once called home. I control the cradle of humanity. All within the hegemony have bowed before me, and those who didn't are dead. Join me, General Kerensky. Become my sword arm and help me impress my word and wisdom upon the other realms. I have no reason to hate you. I wish only peace between us. Join me and convince your men and women to follow you, and I will give you power second only to mine. But should you dare turn a blind eye to the wisdom of my offer and decide not to join, then heed my warning. I control everything the hegemony has, all its defences, all of its fortifications are now manned by people loyal to me. Should you try to attack, every inch of hegemony soil will be stained with the blood of the fallen, and every drop will be burden upon your soul, which must already be heavy with guilt for allowing me to accomplish the complete control of your homelands. Signed, Emperor Stefan Ukras Amaris I. The feeble attempt at conciliation and the mockingly adversarial tone of the letter confused General Kerensky. Even after the losses in the Periphery War, the SLDF was still far strongest of the militaries ever assembled. How did Amaris dare antagonize its commander? For 3 days, General Kerensky stayed in his quarters. His troops were more vocal in their reaction. Because Amaris was from the periphery, many troopers wanted to go on a rampage, destroying anything and anyone from the periphery. Just barely their officers contained them, and prevented a catastrophe. Royal units whose soldiers were recruited from the hegemony were the hardest hit by this news. Most of them wanted to leave the periphery immediately to attack Amaris, but their officers ordered them to wait for Kerensky's decision. One unit, the 34th Royal Battlement Division, wouldn't wait. It left its post in the Outworlds Alliance and headed for home. It was later wiped out above Epsilon Indi, its homeworld, by that planet's automated space defense system. General Kerensky finally broke silence by issuing a long message to his troops and the people of the periphery. He expressed outrage at what Stefan Amaris had done. He stated that considering the nature of the Amaris family, there was little hope for the life of the First Lord or anyone who dared show their loyalty to the League. He went on to say that a state of war obviously existed between the SLDF and the Amaris Empire. He cautioned his troops that it would be foolish to charge blindly Amaris and his forces. The Rimworld's forces were strong enough that the SLDF needed to plan strategy, and General Kerensky said that the SLDF vastly outnumbered the Republican forces. He knew that his adversaries would be in excellent defensive positions, and he worried that one or more of the House militaries, especially the Curetans, might be fighting alongside them. Addressing the people of the periphery, he said it would be ridiculous for his troops to continue fighting the periphery rebels to preserve a Star League whose capital was now enslaved. He declared a ceasefire with all the periphery realms except one. He warned the Rimworld's Republic that he intended to seize the homeworlds of Stefan Amaris to use as his base of operations. This wasn't simply a matter of revenge. Kerensky, mistrustful of all the lords after what had happened, needed a command centre, and the Rimworld's Republic lay undefended. His announcement calmed the soldiers of the Star League, knowing that their leader, a man whose stature and charisma had grown to almost godlike proportion, was back in command, gave everyone hope that all was not lost. Some still disagreed with the general, and felt that they should try to recapture the hegemony immediately. But the news of the fate of the 34 royals restrained even the most impulsive amongst the soldiers. Mech warriors and common soldiers eagerly agreed with General Kerensky's plan to attack the Rimworld's Republic as a chance to repay Amaris for what he'd done to their homeworlds. The Rimworld's campaign. The decision to move on the Rimworld's Republic must have been a difficult one for General Kerensky. He'd long been a vocal opponent of what he called war's unnecessary acts of stupidity against the innocent. Even during a battle's angriest moments, he'd never succumbed to the temptation to strike an easy and telling blow against an enemy's civilian population. General Kerensky was an anachronism, more in tune with a time when warfare had a set of rules and a code of honour. As news of General Kerensky's plan passed through the inner sphere, many people questioned its sense. These individuals believed that the general should stay in the Concordat, summoning his strength and planning his strategy. To embark on a campaign against the Republic seemed a foolhardy waste of effort and lives. Some among the militaries of the 5 inner sphere realms understood. They realised that the Republic was probably woefully underdefended. Officers of the 5 houses also understood that the Rimworld's Republic was the only periphery realm that was not battle-scarred and exhausted. There was every reason to believe that General Kerensky would find plenty of supplies and equipment for his troops in the Republic. Some also realised that the Star League forces would vent their frustration on the Republic and thus be able to fight for the hegemony with less passion and greater thought. When he heard what General Kerensky was planning, Emperor Amaris was livid. He sent messages throughout the inner sphere about the butcher Kerensky and his unholy intention to attack innocent men, women and children. He also sent messages to the remaining periphery battlemech divisions that he had helped form, ordering them to defend the Rimworlds to the last. The offensive began in August 2767, after General Kerensky and his forces approached the Republic from one side, and General de Chevalier, with an equal force, moved in from the other. Before they attacked, the Star League offered the Republic the chance to surrender. Mohammed Salim, regent of the Rimworld's Republic in Amaris' absence, flatly refused. The periphery divisions that Amaris had ordered to protect the Republic had refused the order, though. Their reasons were many, but the most common was one of revulsion for what he had done. The warriors in the divisions had wanted independence from the League, not the death of innocents. And without the protection of the periphery divisions, the Republic had only reservists and a few militia units to defend against the most powerful fighting force in history. Against these odds, many Republican warriors simply gave up, either refusing to fight and going AWOL or defecting to General Kerensky's side at the first opportunity. The main contests were at the 20 fortifications scattered throughout the Republic. Built decades earlier by the Star League, these fortifications were virtual copies of the castles Brian in the Terran hegemony. After Richard Cameron had ordered the SLDF to transfer the fortifications to the Republican units, Stefan Amaris had used them to train his troops on how to best overcome the castles Brian in the hegemony. General Kerensky assaulted the Republican fortifications in a variety of ways: full frontal assaults, combined assaults, bombardment from air and space. As expected, General Kerensky's troops fought the Republicans with unmatched fury. There were many acts that, under different circumstances, would have been called foolhardy and overly violent. The general and his command staff issued special orders in an attempt to prevent the League troops from committing the same sins as their enemies. To their credit, most SLDF soldiers controlled their emotions. There were exceptions, however. The massacre at Kuti Junction, where the 19th Dragoons killed 100 POWs, was the worst incident. The Rimworld's Republic fell quickly. The Hegemony Campaign. The Star League Defense Forces began leaving the Rimworld's Republic in early 2772. They'd spent a year and a half resting and preparing for the offensive, but that time couldn't replace the men and women who'd been lost fighting in the periphery. Most units were severely understrength. On paper, the general had 300 divisions and more than 200 independent regiments, but barely half that number in reality. As the units began loading onto their dropships and transports, General Kerensky received messages from the Inner Sphere that the leaders of the Lyran Commonwealth and the Federated Suns would allow Star League soldiers to pass through their realm without challenge. These messages weren't unexpected. Each had provided shelter and information to SLDF units probing the Amaris defences. The Free Worlds League, which had allowed the presence of the Eridani Lighthorse, now refused the SLDF permission to use League systems as staging areas. Thus did Kenyan Marek act on an old grudge against General Kerensky stemming from an incident when Marek served on General Kerensky's staff. Later in the campaign, Kerensky repaid Marek by using the Orienta system without the leader's consent. The loss of Marek's support was partially offset by an offer of help from the Capellan Confederation. With the aid of 3 realms, the general could shape his strategy. He divided his troops into three major elements, one to travel through each of the accommodating houses toward the hegemony. Once all were in place, the three forces would launch their attacks. The first objective was not to strike for terror, but to link with each other and encircle Stefan Amaris and his troops. Only after the three had linked up and drawn their forces completely around the hegemony would the general begin to move on terror. Some questioned Kerensky's strategy, arguing for a sudden thrust for terror. The general had chosen the slow and cautious approach because intelligence reports indicated that Amaris had been successful in hiring mercenaries and had amassed more than 40 divisions. This, coupled with the lethal space defense systems and the castle's brine, made him a force to be reckoned with. Besides, the general was still worried that the Draconis Combine might side with Amaris and wasn't sure about the Free Worlds League. General Aron de Chevalier was given command of Task Force Sun, which was to travel through the Federated Suns. Admiral Joan Brandt was given command of Task Force Commonwealth, leaving Task Force Confederation to be commanded by Kerensky. The campaign for the hegemony began on July 14, 2772, with SLDF divisions assaulting border worlds and with groups of warships venturing deep into hegemony space, hoping to pick off a few enemy warships or bombard enemy positions. Worlds on the hegemony's border with the Draconis Combine were lightly defended, with Minoru Kurita maintaining a non-violent stance towards Stefan Amaris. The Emperor stationed few units facing the Combine. Sabik, Lambrecht, Kerval, Telos IV, and Murchison fell quickly, with Republican troops retreating before a superior enemy, and with General Kerensky still afraid to expose his back to House Kurita. The SLDF paused to consolidate its gains. House Kurita, always ready to exploit the situation, sent Combine units to occupy the worlds that the Amaris troops were vacating. When Star League forces later advanced, they were surprised to be fighting Kuritan troops on Vega, Imbros III, Styx, and Altair. Wanting no war with the SLDF, however, the Combine forces gave ground readily, only to return after General Kerensky's offensive had moved on. Because hegemony relations with the Federated Suns and the Lyran Commonwealth had always been cordial, the Camerons had built fewer SDS systems and castles brine on their borders. The regular army used its superior training, equipment and numbers to overwhelm the Republican troops on such worlds as Malaris, Ozawa, Surma, and Zabel Ganubi. These fronts were where Star League troops had found the first evidence of atrocities, the massacres of artists on Helen and of scientists on Zabel Ganubi. Though this gave the SLDF an even greater sense of mission, the general and his troops were bogged down on the Free Worlds and Capellan fronts. They also found more and more defenders as they attacked planets closer to Terra. Though Star League troops had a year and a half to train and plan, they were still largely stymied by the Castles Brine and the space defense systems. The long and costly campaign to recapture Nusakan was a prime example. Republican soldiers had changed the access codes on the space defense systems, thwarting SLDF efforts to break through the security and into the computers. Other SLDF strategies, such as drawing drone warships away from a world with a decoy fleet, also failed. For the first 2 years, the only way for General Kerensky's soldiers to deal with an STS was to fight with every drone. Though this worked, it was accomplished at the cost of at least 3 major warships for every planet protected. Castles Brine proved equally difficult. Soldiers had maps of each world's castles, but they didn't know how the enemy would use the fortress. The castles had miles of tunnels large enough for battlemechs to walk through, leading to at least 20 concealed exits. This made it virtually impossible for regular army units to be sure that Amaris wouldn't be popping up behind them. The interconnected bunkers and strongholds were concealed so well that it often didn't matter if a platoon of soldiers knew that a bunker was ahead. They couldn't attack what they couldn't see without sacrificing themselves to draw fire. The early successes produced prizes for the SLDF, however, when they captured several key planets, such as Oliver and Ozawa, more or less intact. As General Kerensky's troops began to meet stiffer resistance, however, they gained less from worlds closer to Terra. The woeful conditions of liberated worlds revealed how horrible life was under Emperor Amaris. Food, water, and power were reserved for his troops. The Republicans drained the resources and supplies from cities they didn't need, often causing the loss of thousands of lives. Living in the countryside was no better. Farmers were told to triple the yield of their farms, or die. Government buildings were destroyed or defaced. On Safel, the local garrison, in a fit of ill humour, painted the government buildings in harsh Dago colours and gave them to prostitutes on the Republic. Universities and instructors suffered as well. Any research project that might have military applications was moved to Terra, so the Emperor's scientists could monitor it, and the rest of the university was destroyed. Professors who were of no value to the military were either killed or forced to build defences for the local garrison. And by the end of 2774, General Kerensky's troops had seized only 11 worlds and were contesting another 10. They'd lost 30 divisions and 40 warships. Morale amongst the troops plummeted as the soldiers realised how terrible life must be for those still living under Emperor Amaris, and how long it would take to free them. New strategies. In November 2774, forces from Task Forces Sun, Commonwealth and Confederation linked up. Emperor Amaris was surrounded by a ring of worlds, each thick with regular army units. The military value of this ring is debatable. Even General Kerensky admitted that the idea of encircling Amaris was strategically impossible. The psychological effect of being surrounded did have a profound effect on Amaris, however. Once he'd heard that his troops had lost Slocum and Connaught, the final 2 worlds in the ring, he reconsidered his defensive strategy. From recordings made by automatic devices in Unity City, it was later learned that Amaris was slowly losing his sanity. Gone was the exultation of those first few months after the coup, when he'd staged huge parties and forced his highborn hostages to attend. By 2774 he was walking through the deserted court with a laser rifle in hand, firing at anything that reminded him of Richard Cameron or General Kerensky. After the encirclement was complete, Emperor Amaris gathered his high command and ordered them to withdraw from worlds without either fortification or an SDS, and to pull back to worlds that did. He felt that this limited withdrawal would strengthen his hold over these key worlds. He ended his meeting with his officers by remarking that, "I can't look at the stars anymore. Every time I do, they seem to constellate the face of Kerensky." Emperor Amaris's orders were carried out in late 2774 and early 2775, as his forces pulled back from 12 worlds. Amaris was pleased that this would use his troops more effectively, and when General Kerensky found out about the pullback, he had reasons to be happy as well. The SLDF gained control of worlds scattered throughout the hegemony. Officers and sailors of the League Navy quickly realised the importance of these worlds because their locations allowed Star League ships to jump across the hegemony without using enemy star systems. 2 of these worlds, Bryant and Asta, were within 1 jump of Terra, and later became important as mustering points. Recapturing another world, Carver 5 provided a psychological lift as well. The SLDF units arrived to relieve the remnants of 3 Marine regiments that had been holding out since the coup 8 years prior. The units had received emergency supplies from the Eridani Light Horse that had allowed them to continue their fight. Star League troops quickly garrisoned the 12 worlds. Amaris's forces had left plenty of minefields and booby traps for the troopers to deal with, and the SLDF spent months removing and evaluating what the enemy had left behind. On some key worlds, such as Graham 4, all that was left was nuclear devastation. What Kerensky did find, however, led to a turning point in the war. Before the war, the planet Nirasaki was the HQ of the Nirasaki Computer Collective, the NCC. These had once been one of the major developers and contractors of the space defense systems. It had the responsibility of developing the incredibly intricate computer communications network that linked drone warships, ground weapons, and supply centers. When General Kerensky and Admiral Janos Grek, commander of the Star League Navy, heard that Nirasaki had been abandoned, they sent troops and scientists to the research facility, hoping to find something they could use against the SDS. At first, it didn't look promising. Most of the NCC buildings had been destroyed and the scientists rounded up and taken to Terra in the first year of the occupation. Searching the levels beneath the buildings revealed more of the same. The computer memories had been dumped and wiped clean, and the paper files burned. When a soldier discovered a small portable computer in a cleaning closet, it turned out that the computer's contents had been hidden by Professor Catherine Glimp. When Nirasaki was being seized by Republican troops, Professor Glimp realised that the space defense system would be a major stumbling block to anyone trying to rescue the hegemony. She filled the limited memory of the portable computer with information that she and her colleagues thought might help. Unfortunately, they had no way to defeat an SDS. In their words, "We just did too good a job, never once imagining we might one day wish the stupid things were more vulnerable." The data that she'd provided, however, allowed engineers and communications specialists to devise an electronic countermeasure. It was a device that swamped the primary communication channels of an SDS with static, forcing computers to use backup links. The hope was that these secondary channels would be less effective in coordinating the various systems, and the device was also supposed to hamper the targeting of the SDS weapons. General Kerensky had no way to test the effectiveness of the new ECM device except in battle. In March 2775 he led an attempt to invade New Home, an SDS-protected world just a few light years from the important planet of Keed. At the head of a large fleet of warships and transports, the general anxiously watched as the new ECM was tried. At first it seemed to have little effect. The nearest drone warships responded to their presence and attacked. Other warships around the planet, however, and the missile and laser batteries on the world seemed confused about how to respond. Their ineffectiveness allowed the general to drop his troops with few losses. New Home quickly fell, and Kerensky finally had his first break of the campaign. He wasted little time in exploiting this new advantage, and from mid-2775 through to late 2778, the SLDF launched a series of attacks against SDS worlds. Terra couldn't be attacked directly because of its advanced and extensive SDS, and so the worlds around it became his next target. Because many of the worlds attacked weren't properly protected by Castles Bryan, the fighting on these worlds was relatively straightforward for the regular army. On worlds like Diran and Procyon, where there were Castles Bryan, the fighting was especially difficult, because there was no high-tech answer for overcoming an enemy firing from inside a bunker, or for mechs popping up from hidden tunnel exits. General Kerensky could have bypassed the mountains where most castles were built, but that would have left whole regions vulnerable to attack and atrocity from Republican troops, who thought nothing of killing civilians to hurt their enemy. The only solution was to break into the forts and hunt the enemy down. On Diran, Republican troops had entrenched in the cities too. The campaign for Diran, lasting 2 years, cost millions of lives and devastated the planet and its economy. In 2775, some of the mercenary units hired by Stefan Amaris began to surrender to the SLDF. Seeing the space defense systems neutralized and the regular army's new tactics for combating Castles Bryan took much of the fight out of many Amaris soldiers and their mercenaries. Also in 2775, some of the Star League member states began to participate in General Kerensky's campaign. Supplies from the Lyran Commonwealth, the Capellan Confederation and the Federated Sons began appearing at worlds held by General Kerensky's troops. While most of the aid was for the many millions of refugees, there was considerable amounts of ammunition and other equipment for the SLDF. Some of the soldiers cynically thought that the member states had begun to contribute only after Kerensky and his army had gained the upper hand. Despite recent successes, General Kerensky felt far from certain of victory. For every world like Keed, where Amaris had destroyed the military installations but had found the planet too useful to ravage, General Kerensky captured another like Kaf, once a jewel in the hegemony, and left in ruins by the Rimworld's forces. The general had lost more than a third of his troops and almost half his navy. He did, however, control all the worlds closest to Terra. He could turn his attention and his remaining forces to the awesome task of seizing the most heavily defended place in the universe.